In today's class, I propose to continue the discussion of the default position of the progressives, institutionally conservative social democracy, and what lies beyond it. And I will take liberties with the plan laid out in the syllabus, because this discussion will probably extend beyond today's class to next week. In reality, this exploration of what lies beyond the limits of institutionally conservative social democracy anticipates all the major substantive themes of our discussion. In the subsequent weeks, the reconstruction of the economy, of the state, and of education. So it is a natural bridge between the analysis of the contemporary predicament of the progressives and our conversation about the future alternatives. I propose to organize my discussion around 5 issues that form elements of this bridge between what we have and what we lack. The first 2 of these 5 issues are just barely within the horizon of the present programmatic debate. The provision of public services and the qualification of public services, and the relation of finance to the real economy. So when I say they are barely within the horizon of the public debate, I mean that they are addressed, albeit inadequately, in the established political debate in the advanced North Atlantic societies. The last 3 of these 5 issues are more fundamental, and they lie almost entirely beyond the limits of the established debate. The hierarchical segmentation of the economy and its consequences for economic inequality and economic stagnation, the practical basis of social solidarity or social cohesion, and the nature of nations and of national difference in the world, and the organization of democratic politics. So I plan to address these issues in sequence, and then, of course, to stop after my initial presentation of each to invite your engagement. So first, let's begin with the subject that is manifestly within the horizon of established debate, although its treatment in that debate is clearly inadequate. And that subject is the provision and the quality of public services. What we have generally in the world by way of the provision of public services is what you might label administrative Fordism, by analogy to Fordist mass production. So remember, Fordist mass production is the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor in the context of very hierarchical and specialized relations of productions. And until the recent rise of the knowledge economy, Fordist mass production has been the most advanced practice of production. Now, the dominant form of the provision of public services in these advanced societies is a kind of administrative counterpart to this mass production in the economy. And that's why I'm proposing to label it administrative Fordism. And it can be defined as the provision of low-quality, standardized public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. When I say low-quality public services, I mean simply services that are of lower quality than the equivalent services that might be purchased in the market by those who have money. Now, the question is, what is the alternative to this administrative Fordism? What is an alternative that holds the greatest promise in the short run to qualify public services, to enhance their quality, and in the longer term to provoke an organization of civil society outside the state? Only an organized society is capable of generating alternative visions of its own future and of acting on them. And so the issue of the organization of civil society outside the state has enormous interest. Now, simply in the spirit of provoking discussion, I immediately suggest the outline of an alternative to this administrative Fordism, going in the direction of a supersession of institutionally conservative social democracy. Under this alternative, we would imagine that the state ensures all the citizens of a universal minimum in the provision of public services. So let's call that the floor. There is a universal floor. Public services are essential to the development of people and of their capabilities. So the issue of the provision of public services seen at a deeper level is the question of how we build people, people and their capabilities. And then under this alternative, the state as well would operate at the ceiling. That is to say, in the development and the financing of the most complex and advanced public services. So the state would occupy the predominant or even the exclusive position, both at the floor and at the ceiling. But there is a broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling. In this broad middle zone, the state would prepare, equip, coordinate, and monitor independent civil society so that independent civil society, would participate together with the state as a partner of the state in the competitive and experimental provision of public services. And civil society could do this through a variety of alternative legal forms, of legal instruments, of cooperative service providers acting not for profit as partners of the state in the competitive and experimental provision of public services. So the background idea is we have two established models of the provision of public services. We have the model that I called administrative Fordism, which is the bureaucratic provision of standardized low-quality services. And then we have the alternative model of the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But this would be a third model in which civil society is prepared, equipped, called to participate together with the state in the provision of public services. And this model would have two main attractions. The first tangible and immediate attraction is that it offers an instrument for the enhancement of the quality of public services. On this view, our best chance of enhancing the quality of public services is to experiment with alternative ways of providing them, and to do so with the engagement of the professionals or the interested parties in each domain. And then the deeper and long-term appeal of this third position, this alternative that I'm describing in the middle zone, is that it serves to provoke the independent self-organization of civil society outside the state. And the independent self-organization of civil society outside the state has enormous practical significance and fecundity. The more organized the society is, as I suggested a moment ago, the more it can generate alternative projects for its own future and act on them. Disorganization is a form of impotence in politics. So an essential objective of a transformative, democratizing politics is to elevate the level of organization, and in this context, especially to elevate what the sociologists call the level of social capital, that is, the density in the network of association in civil society. That is a form of power. It is an aspect of one of the central objectives of all of these alternatives, which is the enhancement of agency, the ability to act. And the ability to act transformatively can never be just the ability to act as an individual, but to act collectively. So this is an account of how the response to the problem of the quality of public services can also serve as a response to the question of the level or the conditions of collective organization in society. So that's the first theme that I want to suggest as lying beyond the limits of historical social democracy. And let me then stop there and ask for your initial comments. So again, the background, if I can make the analogy to the transformation of production, is this. As I've suggested, and as we will discuss further in the course, there is a transformation in the dominant practice of production. After Fordist mass production comes the knowledge economy, a radically experimental practice of production, unfortunately still confined to insular vanguards, but devoted to permanent innovation. Drawing together scientific discovery or experimentalism and the production of goods and services. But if we look now at the structure of the state, its administrative apparatus, we find that almost entirely the state remains at this earlier level in its own activity. That is, the administrative activity in the state is a counterpart to Fordist mass production. The administrative counterpart to the knowledge economy, to experimental knowledge-intensive production, does not exist. And in a sense, this alternative that I've just outlined is an answer to that question. Yes?
I think that defining the term privatization is a poor term.
Is a?
It's not a good term. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we should look at the term to define the privatization as distance yourself from the management of the public, its affairs. And then, like, if I take a national firm, but I sell it to a transatlantic, bigger firm, yes, a state-owned firm, it's privatization. But if I sell it to the public, to a union to run it, yes, like I'm getting it closer, not to the private, I'm getting it closer to the public. So even if I take a private firm and move it from a private-owned national market to a transatlantic multinational firm, it's privatization, because the public in that national sphere is distancing himself from managing the affairs of that firm. You know, in Israel, there was places that we had private firms, but the owner of the firm lived in Israel. So you can demonstrate against him if you have layoffs. But if the owner is in China, what can you do? You can't do anything. So it holds your. So I think the term should be understood otherwise.
I'm not sure I understand. So are you denying that there's a significant contrast between the privatization of public services and this partnership between civil society, not-for-profit, and the state? Do you recognize that there is such a distinction, that these are two different roads to go? And then what is the claim that you're making?
So the claim that I'm making, when you call that when a state-owned factory is moving to the hands of the public, it's not like moving to the. But
this is not about production. So this is about the provision of public services, like education and health.
Okay, so we said about if a public service is going to a private entrepreneur, it's privatization. But if it goes to a group of people that are managing their affairs, it's not. You can't use the same term.
Of course, but so legally,
yes,
the simple distinction between what is privatization and what is not is whether the activity is for profit under the arrangements of corporate law, or is under some different legal regime, and therefore not for profit. So that's the legal basis of the distinction. And in every legal system in the world, there's a different set of rules governing these two sets of activities. So if the activity is for profit, the managers of the firm have in principle a fiduciary obligation to the shareholders to maximize the value, the capitalized value of the firm on the capital markets. And that's distinct from the situation in this social activity outside the market, not for profit. So I'm not sure what you're suggesting. Is what you're suggesting that privatization in favor of profit-different firms can nevertheless have a useful disruptive effect on what I called administrative Fordism? That is, it couldn't be used episodically to disrupt or complicate the situation, so long as it doesn't undermine the obligation of the state to provide this universal floor, as I described it, of the provision of services.
And the opposite, like you see in the 80s, that in a lot of the welfare states, the state nationalized public-owned entrepreneurs, and after 20 years, they privatized this to a private sector guy.
Yeah.
So, it's like the state interfered in making the public less aware and handling its affairs. Like you could say.
Yeah. So, but let's understand the limitations or deficiencies of privatization as compared to this model of partnership of the state with civil society. So the first deficiency is the priority that the law gives to profit maximization for the private firm. So it's an obligation of the managers of a private firm to maximize the value to the shareholders. So that's a first limitation. And it's a very significant limitation. The second limitation is that privatization locks up this activity of inventing new forms of public services in a kind of black box, which is the corporation, which in principle is not completely transparent, is secret, has a narrow goal, is not part of this attempt of civil society to reorganize itself and to reinvent itself in some public discourse. And the third limitation, which is related to the other two, is that the privatization does not serve, or serves very narrowly, what I described as the larger goal of provoking the self-organization of civil society outside the state. So that's the reason why we might think in general that this third solution is preferable to the second solution. Yes?
I definitely sympathize with the idea, but I'm wondering if the project ultimately doesn't boil down to existing alternatives, because, for example,
Two additional?
Existing alternatives, existing ideas.
You mean these two alternatives of either administrative Fordism or privatization?
Exactly. My question is it possible to transcend this dichotomy between regulation and market at the end of the day? Because, for example, when we talk about this civil society and government partnerships, as you just mentioned, to my ears at least, they sound very similar to existing public-private partnerships, for example. So in the end, it's a combination of these two poles.
Well, but the vocabulary of public-private partnership is usually in the context of an entrepreneurial association of the state with profit-driven private firms. So this is another idea. This is the idea that's sometimes brought under the label of the third sector and a different body of law. So you know that in the law we think there's public law and private law, and then in the interwar period in Europe, the jurists developed this idea that there's a third domain of law, which they call social law, which is the law of independent civil society between the state and the economic agents, and not reducible to either public or private law. So that's the idea and I'm not sure why you think that this third domain has a tendency of being reduced to one of the other two domains.
Perhaps thinking in philosophical terms, perhaps it goes back to the very nature of language. It's either yes or no. So it's very difficult to escape this definition of one thing against the other. It's difficult to find this third point, at least from my point of view.
Why? I mean, it seems like an ideological prejudice, a doctrinal prejudice, that we have either private agents or the state. There's something else. There's the organization of civil society. This is a subject of immense significance. Let me relate it to something which is completely different from what we're discussing now, but which I mentioned with the intention of suggesting the significance of this larger theme of the self-organization of civil society. And we're going to come back to it when we discuss the fourth of the 5 issues I have in mind, which is the practical basis of social solidarity, of social cohesion. So take the issue of crime, of criminality. And there are 2 main forms of crime. So there's organized crime, and there's episodic crime. Organized crime involves some struggle with the power of the state. And so it's a war between the state and those who challenge its power. But then there's unorganized crime, episodic crime. And here's the following fact that I want to mention. So it's commonly believed, especially by progressives, that the prevalence of crime, especially violent crime, is related to inequality and poverty. So you say it's just a symptom. The cause is inequality and poverty. Now, if we compare contemporary societies, we find the following. A country like Brazil, my country, is less poor than a country like India. But the prevalence of episodic violent crime in Brazil is greater than the prevalence of episodic violent crime in India. And the question is why? And it seems that the most significant explanation is that the level of grassroots organization in India is much higher, for reasons that are not necessarily all good. So there's religious organization, there's caste organization, there's a heavy degree of social capital, of association. And when society is highly organized outside the state, crime falls down. We know that for a fact. So Brazilian society compared to India at its grassroots level is relatively disorganized. It's amorphous. And this diminishment of social capital, this amorphous character, renders a society susceptible to all sorts of evils, including crime, and less capable of acting collectively. So that's the point. And there are all sorts of. So then the vast question arises: can we organize society to enhance this accumulation of social capital and to strengthen the disposition to cooperate? So again, let me place this in another context, polemically. There are countries that have been successful under different institutional regimes. So take the United States. The Americans are supposedly devoted to this sacrosanct ideology of the free market of theirs. And we know they have the cult of the Constitution. But when they needed to in the war economy, they discarded everything and they organized their economy on a completely different basis. A remarkable episode that I hope we can discuss later in the course. And they were able to cooperate. So they were successful at alternative institutional regimes. Their ability to cooperate is related to many things. One thing that it's related to is the paradoxical effect of their denial of class. So the Americans pretend that they are not a class society. And this pretense makes it harder for them to confront the realities of the class structure. But it has a compensatory advantage, which is this fiction makes it easier for them to cooperate across class lines when they need to, as in a national emergency, the national emergency of the war. So then the question arises. With respect to other societies, we find, they'll go nameless in this conversation, there are other countries that have tried out all sorts of institutional systems and have failed at all of them. And for other reasons, they have difficulty in sustaining this capacity for cooperation. So this is a mysterious subject in the history of social theory. Institutions are very important, but the capacity to cooperate is not the same thing as the institutional structure. We can influence it, but it seems to have a reality of its own. So then there's this question. What can we do? Is it just a brute fact about a society that it has a greater or lesser power of cooperation? Or are there things that we can do that enhance the power of cooperation? For example, suppose that one of the attributes of education is that we organize education cooperatively as teams of students and of teachers, or cooperation among them and among schools. So that's an example of an initiative that you might expect that over time would strengthen the ability to cooperate. If everyone learns in a cooperative context, then they'll be more likely to have the ability to cooperate than if the prevailing style of education is the one that we in fact generally find in the world, which is the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism in the school. So then the idea is that this vital capacity to cooperate, which is not simply a projection or a consequence of the institutional framework, is not just a blind fate, an enigmatic datum of social life. It's something that we can influence. And if we can influence, it has a tremendous significance. So then on this argument about what I'm describing as the third option, it has the narrower use of promising to enhance the quality of public services through their experimental and competitive provision, and the broader use of strengthening the accumulation of social capital. If we can do that, that's fabulous. Yes?
You had asked, is there anything we can do? And it seems like the thing that we can do is to compel a society to think differently about itself and to habituate different modes of daily personal and interpersonal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Where have you seen that happen, and what have been the drivers of those things?
Now, where have I seen it? Doesn't that happen always and everywhere? That is, you certainly you can't be asking the question, does it ever happen? Or as if it happened rarely, miraculously, and usually never happens. So the reality is that It happens all the time, but in little pieces, right? So isn't it the case that it happens in degrees? So I just gave this example of the war economy in the United States. The Americans, when they needed to, discarded their dominant regime of their dominant way of running the economy, and ran it in a completely different way. They were fabulously successful. So in 4 years, they doubled GDP. So that's an example of discovering something about themselves or about the possibilities of social and economic life that they didn't know before. Now, yes?
I'm curious, because that doesn't seem to me to be, inventing or discovering a new national mythos. That seems to be like tapping into a part that was there and maybe dormant or deactivated, and just sort of was foregrounded by circumstance.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way you describe it, again, as in your initial statement of the problem, you seem to be starting from the premise, from this systemic premise that you're either in the dominant form of consciousness or you discover an alternative narrative. But I'm suggesting to you that that's not generally the way things are. So that the idea of the alternative narrative, as if it were systemic substitution, is just the limiting case. That what you discover is that the established reality is richer in contradiction and in possibility than it seemed to be. And I don't think that there's a clear-cut contrast between discovering that there's more variety that you develop for merely instrumental or practical reasons from discovering that there's more structural alternatives. The structural alternatives are not these systemic substitutions. They're the continuation of this discovery of the low-level variety. And this is a very important theme, because this is a theme that runs through all of our discussions. I've kept coming back to this in different contexts, that the dominant spirit of the left in modern Western history, influenced by Marxism, is that there are these regimes or these systems. So you're either in one system or you're in another system. And it seems that your discussion of consciousness or of narratives is in that same spirit. I don't think that's how things are. But it's a very suggestive theme, which is pervasive in all of our discussions. Yes?
A meta question about this topic. What do you think accounts for the pushback, not to single out the person who asked the last question, but what do you think in culture today accounts for the disbelief in that things can change, or that accounts for questions such as the previous one? Aside from your thoughts on the rationalizing tendencies or the escapist tendencies.
Well, this is really a very deep question, right? Because I don't think it's an adequate explanation to point to the influence of these intellectual traditions like Marxism, right? I mean, what does Marxism mean to the majority of the American population? So that can't be an adequate explanation. I think there's something deep about the relationship between the experience of agency, of action, and fatalism. So Goethe makes this remark that the person who observes and who is passive is always a fatalist. Because the position of observation and of passivity induces fatalism. And then you experience a diminishment of agency, and then the views of social life that begin to seem more plausible are those that surround the established arrangements with a halo of naturalness and necessity. And so it becomes circular and a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's as if we never entirely surrendered to that view. It's as if that's the view that we have so long as we're passive. But then as we begin to have an experience of action, of agency and transformation, then we discover contradiction and transformative possibility, and we begin to change our views. And another counter-narrative develops about transformative opportunity. So the crucial element seems to be this relation between the experience of transformative agency and the representation of the circumstance that we're in. And that's why this a little bit of agency goes a long way, I guess is what I'm saying. Because then the thread begins to unravel and you develop a different position. So constantly in history, we have this experience that a society seems to be one way, and it seems to have one culture. And then something is shaken up, and then those same people, which seem to be dominated by that consciousness and that culture, display a completely different face. And as if they were holding in abeyance, as if they had a mental reservation of a completely different moral experience, suggesting that we're more than what we seem to be. So, this is a precaution against all forms of cultural determinism. So it happens all the time. So take, for example, Japan. Now, the image of Japan is it's a solidaristic, group-oriented culture. It's anti-conflict. But we know that in the 1920s and 30s, Japanese industrial relations, for example, were among the most violent and conflictual in the whole world. So it's the opposite. So then there's a triumph of conservative statecraft, and they arrange a certain political economy, a system, and then people naturalize their system, and it seems, well, that's their nature. But it's not their nature. And it's so that the thing that seems to be consciousness is just the reflection of this accommodation to the situation. So this is what's fantastic about historical experience and about action, which is that we're not what we seem to be. And we wear a certain face, a certain mask in the historical circumstance, but there's a hidden us, which is waiting to be revealed in a different situation. And constantly in these arguments of ours here, I take it that the experience of transformative agency in the small, even at the micro level, has a crucial role in this transformation of consciousness. Yes?
So my problem is that I see it already that I see your proposal almost already too much. So what you're talking about are institutions of civil society that are providing public services, that are non-profit oriented. So we are probably at this part mostly talking about religious institutions and non-profit NGOs, if we want to draw an analogy to the existing world. And those institutions, I got the impression, are very often exclusive. So
yes.
What you are saying about social democracy could easily apply to any civil societal institution that is providing services. So how do you deal with that?
So I think it's interesting because you're right. The first interpretation would be you look at the established third sector, which is exclusive, and as in the church providing its orphanages, its hospitals, and so forth, because that's what's most accessible. So I'm imagining, as it were, a next step in which the state actively provokes the organization of cooperatives, of educational professionals, of health professionals, of professionals in different aspects of the self-organization of society. So it goes beyond this inherited structure of the third sector, because otherwise, just as you suggest, it would be very narrow. So I'm assuming that I'm not taking the established organization of civil society for granted. So in all of these societies, in all these countries, civil society is very unequally organized. The level of organization that exists is dependent on the religious divisions, the confessional divisions of society. And so I'm imagining that it becomes a project to provoke the self-organization of civil society around specialties, around professions, around the interested publics. So to create a dynamic. And then these pre-existing forms of the third sector are enveloped in this larger subsequent wave of the self-organization of civil society. That's what I'm supposing. I'm not supposing simply a delegation of the power of the state or a partnership of the power of the state with the existing narrow forms of the self-organization of civil society.
Okay, but the state doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So it's
Of
not
course.
as if, the problem is the existing institutions already have a disproportionate power. So I could imagine the NRA having probably the organizational capacity to cluster around security issues.
Sure, of course. Of course.
People just don't have that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So all of these subjects are connected. So all of these structural changes that are the object of discussion here presuppose an elevation of the temperature and a hastening of the pace of politics. So a transformation of the character of democratic politics. And they're all connected. So that's, of the 5 subjects that I want to discuss is beyond social democracy, that's the 5th. And in a sense, the most fundamental, right? The transformation of the character of democratic life. Because, just to anticipate the discussion, we have in the world these weak or flawed or low-energy democracies that exist in the context of very unequally organized societies. And when the democratic state is weak, it then becomes porous to capture by these narrow organized interests of civil society. And the alternative that is proposed for that in the world is a technocratic vanguard that seizes the power of the state and presents itself as the virtual representative of the collective interest, like the Communist Party of China. And what we don't have is the example of a high-energy democracy which rejects the authoritarian shortcut and elevates the level of collective engagement in political life and adopts a series of constitutional arrangements that resolve impasse quickly and hasten the pace of politics. So I think it's correct to say that our chances of moving successfully in this direction, in the direction of this alternative provision of public services, in the long term depend on our success in changing the background conditions. And the background conditions in 2 main domains of human experience. One domain is the organization of politics, of democracy, and the other domain is culture. So to have a culture that is hospitable to the radicalization of the experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. And again, I don't think that's just a brute fact about society. that's something that we can do something about, for example, in education. So that if we can organize education deliberately to, for example, by teaching every subject from contrasting points of view, to form people who are inclined to this radical experimentalism. They're all connected. But when I say they're all connected, there's a problem, right? Again, it comes back to the issue of the negative example of Marxism. Because when we think structurally, given this background of the history of social theory, our default assumption is to imagine that to think structurally means to think that there's a system, and it's all an indivisible package. So you either have that system and you manage it, or you substitute it by another system. And I don't think it's like that. There aren't these systems. There aren't these indivisible packages. So real transformation is always combined and uneven development in which you advance in a certain direction, and then you hit against limits which result from the failure to advance in other directions. Exactly in the way you just suggested in your discussion. So I think that's my working assumption is that's our best hope of transformation, right? That we want structural change, but we don't want to represent structural change as systemic substitution. So that we're either within a system or we're replacing a system. And these are all examples of that problem. So we could begin, then we hit against this limit. Just you gave the example. We'd find that when we're trying to organize civil society is unevenly organized. The groups that are organized are lobbies that come from this uneven organization, and they then are the first bidders for this power of the state, which we then have to defeat in some way. But the mere fact of developing in that direction is already a complication. It already goes beyond the limits of this institutionally passive social democracy, and it's a trigger of transformations. Yes?
No, to prove your point, as a social democrat, I'm a little bit afraid of that. So the idea that...
what's the that?
That is this transformation that could completely go in the wrong way. So
yes.
The transformation that would lead to a monopolization of certain services by institutions that I'm fearful for and that I wouldn't consider as progressive, but as
yes.
maybe too exclusive and
yes.
would probably lead to a dystopia. So I
yes.
agree with you that there
is so this, again, this is a potent, pervasive theme in our discussions, and it comes up all the time in programmatic discussions because we discuss transformation. And what is the guarantee that a transformation cannot be misdirected, right? And the answer was given by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead when he said, the business of the future is to be dangerous. So there are no guarantees, and it's a struggle. And if you believe in struggle and in alternatives, you say the answer to the dangers of struggle is more struggle. And that's not how, in general, the conservative social democrats think, or the liberals. They think we want a world of guarantees. But in this veil of tears of ours, there are no guarantees. And so this is the roller coaster of historical experience that we are on. Yes?
So when we talk about experimentalism, do we have to get the consent of the people who are going to be the object of experimentalism in that sense? Do we subject these alternatives to referenda or elections? Or is it something that technically...
But are you giving, because now we're talking about different things. So there's the generic concept of experimentalism, but then there are particular examples like the provision of public services, of course, subject of debate in society. But I gave this as the first of these 5 issues because it's the subject that, at least in the politics of the North Atlantic societies, is the most manifest. So it's not as if this were a fictional subject. It is an established theme of political contest, the quality of public services. And there's a practical issue of what's our best prospect of enhancing the quality of public services. So the simple claim that I'm making as the point of departure of the argument is, first, that administrative Fordism is not an adequate basis on which to enhance the quality of public services. And the privatization of public services is not the only alternative. So that's just the beginning. And so it appeals to this desire for higher quality services and for the breakdown of this situation in which those who have money can buy higher quality services on the market. That's the basis of it. And the rest is then the practical experimentation. Now, then let's come to the second subject in these 5 themes, which is the relation of finance to the real economy. And this second subject is also at least barely within the horizon of the established debate. It's not an invention. So in all of the electoral cycles over the last 20 years, and especially since the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the theme of the relation of finance to the real economy has been a major theme. Now let me begin by stating 3 enigmas about finance, just as the factual background to this part of the discussion. The first enigma is that, to a very large extent, in the advanced established market economies, the production system is self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. The production system finances itself. All of the empirical research that has been done suggests that well over 80% of the financing of production is generated within the production system. Well, that simple observation then leads to a disquieting question. If the production system finances itself, what's the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's an obvious question, basically not asked, or asked only, so the most fundamental questions are not asked, right? So what's the point of all of that? So, and theoretically, it's this liquid capital is to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, there seems to be this disassociation. The relation of the capital markets or finance to the real economy is episodic and oblique. So episodic, for example, initial public offerings. Or oblique, the claim that the trading of shares on the stock market establishes a benchmark of value that allows the firms then to borrow from the banks. But for the most part, they don't borrow from the banks. And we know that the major firms now are sitting on vast stores of liquid capital. So that's the first enigma. What does it all mean? This liquid capital there. What is its relation to the real economy, given that the real economy is driven from out inside itself and finances itself. The second enigma is that there is the following asymmetry. In good times, that is when there is no crisis, finance, the capital markets seem to be largely indifferent to the real economy. The exception of these oblique and episodic relations. And in bad times, it becomes destructive. So there's a turmoil. Instability begins in the financial markets, and then it ramifies out and ends up having destructive effects on the real economy. Now comes the third enigma. The third enigma is that what, in theory, should be a major activity of the capital markets, which is to fund the creation of new assets, and specifically to fund the creation of new assets in new ways, turns out to be a minuscule portion of total financial activity in all the economies in the world. So of the large economies of the world, the United States is the one in which venture capital is most established. Venture capital is the core example of this activity. Venture capital is insignificant quantitatively. It's much less than 1%. It's something like 0.4% of total financial activity, even if you define it in very expansive terms. So the activity that theoretically should be central to financial activity is almost non-existent in quantitative terms compared to total financial activity. Now let's think about the idea structure that bears on our interpretation of these three related enigmas. So the dominant way of thinking in economics and in legal thought, insofar as it has been inspired by economics, is that by definition, a competitive capital market allocates resources to their most efficient use. Unless there is some failure, some market failure. Some failure in competition, some asymmetry of information that can explain the misallocation of resources. And if then there is a misallocation of resources resulting from imperfect competition, including informational asymmetries, the answer is a regulatory response to the localized market failure. So there are only localized market failures, and then there are localized regulatory responses to the localized market failures. But there's no question ever of a systemic alternative. Now, that's the problem. So it seems that in this way of thinking, what is denied is what is in fact the reality, which is that different economic institutions can either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy. There's no natural or necessary way of organizing the capital market because there's no natural and necessary way of organizing any market. And any particular way of organizing the capital markets establishes the relation between finance and the real economy in a particular way, and either tightens or loosens this connection of finance to the real economy. So I go back to an example I gave before in another context of the struggle that took place in the United States in the first half of the 19th century about the national bank. I gave the example. There was a contest over the national bank. Hamilton had established the first national bank of the United States as the instrument for the management of the public debt. The emergent plutocracy in the United States used it as a major instrument. And then in the subsequent decades, there was a contest over the national bank. And this contest resulted in the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the dissolution of the second national bank of the United States. For over 100 years, all banks operating nationally were prohibited in the United States. And the Americans organized the most decentralized system of credit at the service of the local producer that ever existed in the world. When they did that, they were not regulating the financial market. They were creating a kind of financial market that had not existed before. They were innovating in the legal and institutional constitution of the financial market, and that then shapes the degree to which the finance and the real economy are linked or not linked, and how they're linked. In other words, there's no natural linkage, and there's no natural degree of linkage. The degree of linkage and the form of linkage are artifacts of the institutional and legal arrangements. Now, stated in that way, this may all seem obvious, but actually it's in complete contradiction to the dominant ideas. The dominant ideas are the ones that I've stated about how to think of financial markets. So this is a subject of great interest. We come to discuss the knowledge economy, the advanced practice of production. One of the conditions for its dissemination is access to credit, to capital. It's not the only condition, and access to credit only matters when combined with access to other things: technology, knowledge, advanced practice, knowledge, markets. But it is a crucial condition. So then we would say, we want to change this relation. This isn't an invented subject, the subject of finance. It's, as I say, it's within the horizon of the established debate. And we could imagine the beginning of a series of proposals to change this relation of finance to the real economy. And these proposals could have a negative aspect and a positive aspect. So the negative aspect would be to discourage, or at the limit even prohibit, financial activity, forms of financial trading, that have no plausible relation to the expansion of output and the enhancement of productivity. So the first thing to say is that this idea should not be interpreted as an attack on the speculative element in finance. So this is a common mistake that's made in the progressive discourse, the attack on speculation. Speculation is useful if it is in the service of the development of information and of the assignment and organization of risk. The problem is not speculation of speculative finance per se. The problem is the disconnection between the speculative element in finance and the agenda of the real economy. So let's take a specific example. So take thank you. So take take the futures markets. So options contracts, futures, developed in the context of commodity markets where they contributed to liquidity. It's not at all clear that they contribute to liquidity in the context of equity markets and so forth. So it's a factual debate about what does and does not serve the purposes of real economic activity. That's the negative side. And then comes the positive side, which is what can be done to mobilize the dormant productive potential of the capital. The capital that's in the pension systems, the capital that's in the banks. And how can the power of the state be used to mimic the activity, the undone work of private venture capital on a large scale? That is, the creation of new assets in new ways. So we have in the 20th century these massive examples of the use of public investment in production during the New Deal, during Roosevelt's New Deal, under the National Recovery Administration. The Americans developed what was at that time the largest single vehicle of investment in the whole world by the state. Now, it wouldn't have to be done in that form of centralized administration. We could imagine that the investment funds are tapped and they are managed by independent, professionally managed and competitive funds set up by the state as a kind of vanguard of private venture capital to do this work of investing in the creation of new assets in new ways. But that's just an example of what would be the problem of design. To me, it seems that the crucial element lies in the acceptance of the initial assumption that there's no natural way of connecting finance to the real economy, and that the question of the relation of finance to the real economy is an empirical question, susceptible to institutional variation. So the degree to which finance relates to the real economy and the way in which it relates depends on the specific institutional arrangements. That's a revolution in thinking. And it's one that the progressives would accept if they then abandon their structural dogmatism. So it goes back to the fundamental distinction, the fundamental conception of what makes a progressive in the contemporary situation. And the answer that I'm proposing in these arguments of ours is twofold. So the first answer is that what distinguishes the progressive from the conservative is that the progressive does not accept the established institutional arrangements in each range of social life as the impassable horizon within which we have to fulfill established interests and ideals, but takes these institutions as up for grabs for piecemeal experimentation and change. And the second answer to the question of what makes a progressive has to do with the goal, with the objective, is that the progressive wants the mass of ordinary men and women to have a greater power of action, of agency. And so that he or she can turn the tables on the circumstance in which he finds himself. And so this argument about finance as an example, is an instance of that larger idea. And it's an idea that could have many manifestations in every domain of social life. So that's the second theme. Yes?
You mentioned that the utility of speculation is that it develops information and assigns risk.
Yes.
Do you think either of an alternative mechanism for this or a place to situate speculation that is outside of finance or the state?
I'm not sure I understand. What do you mean?
So
the question is, why is what's the perspective from which you're asking the question? Is it a perspective of suspicion of the utility of speculation, or what?
No, it's a question of whether those things could be done by alternative. Like, is speculation the necessary route?
Well, in finance, right, if we define speculation capaciously enough, speculation is trial and error, but in which people are, it's not an idle experimentalism, it's an experimentalism in which they have stakes. That's what speculation is. So it's a series of conjectures about the future that are based on different interpretations of the present. So my assumption in this argument is it's not an attempt to stamp out speculation. Speculation is not bad. So this is related to a series of other debates about. So in mid-20th century social democracy, we come to this discussion of the New Deal, for example. The theme of the New Deal, the central theme of the early experimentalism of the New Deal was orchestrating competition. So concerted action between the state and private agents, diminishment of economic instability. And now I'm speaking from a completely different direction. Economic instability is not bad. Economic instability is good. And financial speculation is an example of economic instability. So I think it is a mistake of the leftists, of the progressives, to associate themselves with the suppression of instability in finance or anywhere else. Instability is experimentation. And if we're interested in structural alternatives, but at the same time we are determined to avoid structural dogmatism, the only way that we can reconcile our interest in structural alternatives with the avoidance of structural dogmatism is by radicalizing experimentation in all sorts of different ways. Now, we've actually just discussed two ways. One way is through the provision of public services, and the other way is in our treatment of the relation of finance to the real economy. So, applying that to the issue of speculation, the issue is then, the central issue is how does it serve the real economy? If it serves the real economy, it's not bad, it's good. It's only bad if it has no relation to the real economy and then becomes a form of gambling. That's the casino. And that then has the potential then actually to harm real economic activity, as we saw in the sequel to the crisis of 2008. So it then becomes a practical question of the organization of the arrangements. That's the spirit. So I think if it's as if we were approaching this issue of the structure from the periphery, from the penumbra. So one approach was through the public services. Now the other approach is to finance. But if we begin to think that way and to act that way in these particular areas, then we begin to think that way all over. Everything. And that's a completely different way of thinking. Because then it's not a structure. We don't think capitalism, the market economy, it's a structure with a predetermined content. If we're not going to replace it, we have to manage it. It has certain intrinsic rules. That's the basic, that's the conservative idea. And the remarkable thing about contemporary social democracy is that it accepts that idea. So it's then a conservative political project, on my view. This is really the central element in the debate. Now, unless you want to discuss another aspect of this theme of the relation of finance to the real economy, let me go on to the third theme. And I was thinking that the third theme, I would choose the hierarchical segmentation of the economy and the fate of the knowledge economy. But let me postpone that, actually, because it's very complicated and requires a great deal of time to address adequately. And let me go ahead to what was the fourth theme now, which I called the practical basis of social solidarity. It has a micro and a macro aspect. And it is both a practical and a philosophical argument. So the general problem is what holds people in these societies together? What is the basis of cohesion or solidarity? So let me state the micro aspect and the macro aspect. The micro aspect is one to which I have already referred. Under institutionally conservative social democracy, the default position of the progressives in the world, the residual basis of social solidarity is money transfers organized by the state. So, through redistributive social entitlements, the state transfers. And that then is the default or the residual expression of social solidarity. The central claim I make with respect to this micro aspect of the problem of social solidarity is that money is a completely inadequate social cement. It is not a sufficient basis of social solidarity ever. Its inadequacy is concealed to the extent that there is a significant level of homogeneity, of ethnic, cultural, religious homogeneity in the society. If the society is a tribe, then that is the underlying basis of solidarity, sameness. And money then becomes just this supplementary expression. But if the level of homogeneity diminishes, then the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. Now, that's exactly what's happened in these social democracies, and especially in Europe, in the home ground of historical social democracy, that the diminishment of homogeneity provoked by labor mobility and migration has revealed the inadequacy of money as a social cement. That's what I'm calling the micro problem. And then once again, we could see this as a problem or an opportunity for transformation, for the provision of an alternative form of social cement. Now let me address what I want to call the macro problem of social solidarity, which is the very nature of nations in a world of democracy. What is the nation? And how should we think of it? And what holds it together? So we can imagine a spectrum, just as a thought experiment, in which on one pole of the spectrum, the nation is like a tribe. It's like a family of families. Its basis is quasi-biological. There's a consanguinity and a convergence, and they're the same blood and the same form of life that results from this common descendants. And on the other pole of the spectrum, the nation is made of people who descend from all sorts of different origins or come from all over. But they develop together a common form of life. They're engaged with one another in a common project. So at this other pole of the spectrum, we think the following. Society has no natural and necessary form. And humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. So the significance of the national difference in this world in this world of democracies, is that the national differences is a kind of moral specialization within humanity. There's no natural form of social life. And so we develop different ways of being human. And these different ways of being human are the nations organized under their different institutional arrangements. Now, notice that this conception of the second pole in the spectrum contradicts a major premise of classical liberal political philosophy. The premise of classical liberal philosophy is that we should seek to have a system of right or a set of institutions that is neutral with respect to different visions of the good, to different conceptions of humanity. The premise of this idea of the spectrum, or of the second pole of the spectrum, is that that's impossible. There is no institutional framework that is neutral among visions of the good. Every institutional framework, every system of right, tilts the scales, encouraging some forms of human experience and discouraging others. So neutrality is an illusion on this view, and a dangerous illusion. It's a dangerous illusion because the claim of neutrality always serves its opposite. That is, it serves to entrench some particular version of humanity, some particular way of organizing social life against attack, claiming that it's neutral. But this illusory goal of neutrality nevertheless has a kinship with a realistic and immensely valuable objective. The objective is that a form of life be open, that it be porous, that it be capable of accommodating a large range of human experience and of incorporating contradiction. And above all, that it be susceptible to correction and to challenge in the light of experience. So that it be rich in variety and contradiction, and that it be corrigible. That's the realistic goal. that should not be confused with the illusory and dangerous ideal of neutrality. And so that's on this view, the right way to characterize this second pole of the spectrum. Now, in this situation in which all of the nations that exist in the world are in some intermediate position in the spectrum, that is, they've gone beyond being mere tribes, but they don't yet fulfill this ideal of the moral specialization within humanity, we find a characteristic form of contemporary nationalism, which is not understood. So in earlier historical periods, the national difference was manifest in an attachment to concrete customs, a customary way of life. What does it mean to be a Roman, an ancient Roman? It means to adopt the customs of the ancestors, of the ancient Romans, their way of life. Now, in this period of world history, we have a situation in which these tangible, concrete, collective identities are increasingly eviscerated. They're emptied of content. So the states in the world look around the whole world to see what new institutions or arrangements they have to adopt to be successful in this worldwide practical, economic, military, and ideological emulation. And then they come to the altar of world success, and they tear out a part of themselves. So that's what I mean by this collective identity being emptied out of tangible content more and more. But the will to be different, rather than being diminished by this evisceration of tangible content, is on the contrary all the more aroused. So here is the peculiar poisonous character of the contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side, and they hate each other. Not because they are different, but because they are becoming alike, and because they want to be different. This is the character of nationalism, of our nationalism. And so to the extent that collective identities are tangible, they're porous. They don't have fixed limits. And then they're mixed up. They can be combined. But if they are abstract, and if they are the expression of this impotent will to difference, then they become the objects of an intransigent faith. And they cannot, even in principle, be compromised. So what are we to do about this situation, which happens in this middle place in the spectrum that I described, in these two ideas of the national difference? So there are two positions, basically. Let's say one position is the position of liberal cosmopolitanism. Suppress the desire for difference. The other position would be to say, the way to render this desire for difference fertile and less dangerous is to equip it, so that these different nations of the world can produce real difference. Then they need a different kind of economic order, a different kind of politics, so that they can become different as they want to be. And then if by becoming different, their difference will be useful to humanity rather than dangerous. It's dangerous insofar as it's frustrated. And it's less dangerous insofar as it can be fulfilled. That's the basic idea. And then we can see all of these arguments about the economic and political alternatives as in some way addressing that question. Now, then let's go back to what I call the micro issue. So these nations become more heterogeneous And then the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. What's the solution? There has to be something beyond money. And on this view, regarding the micro aspect of the problem, the only adequate practical basis of social solidarity is direct engagement with other people outside the boundaries of family selfishness. There's no substitute for that. Now, let's imagine a series of ways in which we could express this direct engagement. So we discussed one when we were talking about public services a moment ago. Engagement in the development of public services. What are public services? Public services are the construction of people. It's civil society building itself over time through collective action. Another example of this engagement with others is through the organization of education, that it be cooperative, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. And a third example is the universalization of a principle of mandatory social service. So the principle would be every able-bodied adult in society has at least two positions, a position in the production system and a responsibility to take care of other people outside his own family, either at a certain moment in life, for example, as an alternative to mandatory military service, or as part of the working year, but some form of engagement. Now, we know that people are capable of this engagement. So I'll just give you one fact, which an interesting fact about humanity. So in philanthropy, of course, the gift of time is much more important than the gift of money. Now, a fact is that there seems to be an almost linear relation between the number of children that someone has and the likelihood that he will give time. Now, this is completely counterintuitive. You'd think that the more children you have, the less time you'd have. So how could you give time if you had many children? But it seems that the way it works is just the opposite. The more children you have, the more likely you are to give time. So it's as if the human heart expands. There's no time budget. The question is how big we are. And so we have more potential than we seem to have. And so this is the empirical basis of this question of reciprocal engagement outside the limits of family selfishness. So I described the micro problem, and I suggested there's not one big solution to it. There are a series of initiatives that enhance the basis of social cohesion beyond money. And then I described the macro problem. The macro problem is the empty and poisonous, and consequently poisonous character of modern nationalism. And the solution is not to suppress the desire for difference, but to equip it. And that's the object of the whole discussion. And now, what's the connection between the micro problem and the macro problem? They both, in some way, bear on this mysterious element of the disposition to cooperate and the enhancement of our power to cooperate, which is a tremendous form of collective power. The more we can cooperate, the more powerful we are. And the more we have this ability to transform our circumstance. And we can imagine this enhancement of the power to cooperate from below, or the micro problem, or from above, the macro problem. So I think this is a tremendous subject. It's fabulous because it's both practical and philosophical. It shows something deep about politics, that when it's serious, it's religious. It's about who we are, and it's not just a accommodation of practical interests. It has to do with the level of our ambition in the transformation and the elevation of human life. So I've just, because we're here in this setting, I've described it in a philosophical form, but I think it's very clear. Don't you think? Don't you agree with me that that once we begin to think in this way, we can connect this way of thinking with all sorts of tangible issues in these contemporary societies? Yes.
A question about national solidarity.
Yes.
Michael Lind believes that the end goal of national solidarity is that the result of all this is that eventually you intermarry, you have children, and you make a nation, a biological nation. And the result of the social solidarity that you speak of is really, in the end, to become a biological nation. Do you have any points of disagreement with
Well,
him?
totally, right? Because I think, so one of the several philosophical assumptions of this idea is that the highest form of solidarity is the form that flourishes in the context of difference, right? So it's the ability to be connected with the different is higher than the ability to be connected with a projection of oneself, which is a kind of narcissism. So it's this ability of humanity to be connected in the midst of difference. That's higher. And similarly, the differences that we create that are projects for the future are higher than the differences that we inherit. Prophecy is higher than memory. Just as cohesion in the midst of difference is higher than cohesion on the basis of sameness, and so forth. So certainly in this argument that I'm making, there are a set of moral hierarchies that have to do with the level of ambition. And so the whole idea of the spectrum that I described, from the tribe to the non-tribe, is the denial of that idea that you just mentioned. And now, I think that if you relate it to the United States, it's hard to see how the first idea, the tribal idea, could be reconciled to the canonical doctrine of the United States, right? It's not a country founded on the basis of blood. It's a country founded on the basis of an idea, or an idea that the Americans have about themselves. So that the conception of consanguinity seems to be a kind of retreat from this larger ambition. Yes?
You had said that the only adequate basis of social solidarity is direct engagement.
Direct engagement, yes.
That seems to be served by physical proximity. I can have more social solidarity with you than I can with, say, a Californian or a Kansan.
Yes.
They're not here. How do you reconcile the local dimension of social solidarity with the fact that you also consider local heresies?
Well, social service is not necessarily dependent on local. So to give you an example of our debate in Brazil. So we had a debate about our national military strategy, and there was a debate about the maintenance of the principle of military conscription. So you know, many countries in the world, including the United States, have accepted a mercenary army. So an army of poor people to fight military expeditions of the American elites. Entirely contrary to Republican principles. The army is not a group of people that others pay to fight their wars to defend them. The army in a democracy is the nation in arms. It's itself. And so then there was this debate about whether to maintain conscription or not. And I passionately defended the cause of conscription. But then those subject to conscription are many more than are required for military service. So then the idea was to establish in the law the principle that everyone exempted from military conscription would be subject to mandatory social service. Now, what does that mean? That means that we take the bourgeois youth of Sao Paulo and we send them to the Amazon for a year or two of military service in their professions. Now, we can't do that. That's the law. But a government in Brazil that could enforce that could do anything. Because if you could do that, then all bets are off. So it's a principle in the law, but it's on this idea that the connection doesn't have to be local, depending on how you organize the service. Yes?
I think your exposition of the current situation of debate is absolutely flawless, but I have two observations, perhaps. Mm-hmm. One of them is, I failed to see why tribalism, in that dichotomy you drew between tribalism and cosmopolitanism, is a worse option in terms of value. Why is human existence as tribes is necessarily a worse option than
liberal, what I call liberal cosmopolitanism.
The third way you're proposing. Mm-hmm. And the second point is that the two conceptions, both tribalism and cosmopolitanism, as you just explained, accept the basic psychoanalytical fact of the fear that humans have of themselves. So you see the other, you see a mirror in the other when you look at the other, and then you have fear. And I think that fact is beyond empiricism. It's about human nature, mm-hmm. and you can't prove or disprove it. And when you talk about cooperation...
But what's the relation of the second point to the first point? What's the relation of that to the debate about liberal cosmopolitanism?
None. The first point is a value judgment that I made personally. And the second one relates to the dichotomy that you drew. And then,
So what is the second point?
The second point is the two conceptions, the tribalist and cosmopolitanism, yes, as you described them, accept this, what I would call this basic psychoanalytical fact, that you fear yourself, you look at the other, and you see some similarities, and then from that arises fear. And then the third alternative you're proposing...
You mean fear of yourself, in a sense?
Fear of seeing yourself in the other, at least, and that's, it goes back to Freud, at least in my view, these mm-hmm. primal essential fears. And then the third alternative you're proposing, cooperation. Are you trying to get around this, what I would call this basic psychoanalytical fact of the fear of the other, the fear of seeing yourself in the other? Is that what you're proposing? I don't know.
So I'll say a few things, and we're running out of time, unfortunately. So the premise of the rejection of liberal cosmopolitanism is this idea that humanity develops only by developing in different directions. So there's no natural way of being human. And we want there to be in the world a broad range of experiments in ways of being human. That has many complications and contradictions. So, for example, suppose someone is born into a form of social life, into a nation, with which he has no affinity. So then one of the conditions for the acceptance of this view is that everyone be able to escape. No one should be imprisoned in the nation in which he happens to have been born. So that's very fundamental. then the condition for labor mobility, for immigration, becomes intimately related to this idea of moral specialization within humanity. Then on your question of fear of the others, there's another assumption, which is also contestable, which is this idea that most of the evil that arises in the world does not result from malevolence. It results from weakness. And we want people to be stronger. And the stronger they are, the more likely they are to be magnanimous. As in this example that I gave of the poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. So one of the ways in which they become stronger is that they be capable of participating in the creation of collective difference. And they have this experience of fulfillment in the creation of a distinctive form of life. Then they can be more generous. And then we have a better chance. So it's not a complete answer to your problem of the fear, but it's that we are more fearful and more dangerous to one another insofar as we're weaker. I want us to be stronger. Well, we'll continue this fabulous discussion.
If you're an undergrad, I'm doing office hours for the hour after this, for 3 to 4 after this class.
Sorry, I forgot to write down your office hours. I'm in section.
Yeah, that's fine. I just don't want. I know we don't look over. But I have to sleep it
Me parece que assim fosse eles, o senhor falou, o tribalismo vê na diferença essa possibilidade da prosperidade, já que as pessoas têm essa necessidade de se diferentes nações trarão mais prosperidade. E ao passo que o cosmopolitanismo quer suprimir esse sentimento. Mas ambos aceitam essa premissa básica, não? De que as pessoas não querem se identificar com o outro. Então, a partir desse desejo primordial, o liberalismo diria, bom, vamos suprimir
It's going to mile a minute at like.
Oh, yeah, I know what it's.
Not as